Hi there, this is Game Sweet Zone, where we try to recreate the instruments and structures of video game music. For our third piece, we're covering Ordon Ranch from the Legend of Zelda, Twilight Princess, composed by Koji Kondo, Asuka Ota, and Toru Minegishi in 2006. I couldn't find a specific composer credited with this piece, so I listed them all. The tempo is 220, or 110 if you wish. Import the original as a reference and use a metronome, please. The time signature, which tells us how many beats are in a measure as well as note duration values, is 3/4, 3 beats per measure. The French horn plays a prominent role in the piece. Our issue here is that it doesn't let us edit its envelope, the attack, decay, sustain, and release. Since we're at this inconvenience, we will just have to find ways to replicate the original French horn's properties. Here is its status. The sustain level doesn't seem to be high for some notes. When a note is being held, it drops to a lower level than the highest. I'm guessing sustain levels are moderate. Anyway, I'm going to use volume automation to mimic the sustain. An automation is simply a tool that lets us map out changes to individual channels for certain points throughout our music. In FL Studio, they can have multiple patterns, like channels do, so we can create multiple automation patterns that suit what we're aiming for. Anyway, as soon as a note reaches its highest point, we're going to slightly and slowly automate the volume down, and back to its original state when the next note comes. Another important option we need to utilize is key switching, which allows us to switch between articulations by placing a note out of the instrument's range that won't be sounded, where we need the switches to occur. The original seems to switch between your typical sustain and then staccato, which is a short note detached from the rest. This combination of volume automation and key switching can take some time to actually finish, but it is one of the necessary steps to replicating the articulations. Everything's fine, Jerry. Anyway, the main melody doesn't switch between staccato and sustain, so we have no need for key switching. We'll simply try to set the velocity levels based on the changing volumes, and still use volume automation to replicate some of the original's attributes. Here's the volume automation for the main melody. Now here's the main melody itself. An average guitar plays the arpeggios here, which are the notes of a chord played one after another. Here are its properties. Note that I gave it a high release, which is like the original. This high release lets us fill the space of sound much more easily. Although some changes were slight, we still altered its velocity, which is basically how hard the notes were strummed or picked. I like to make slight changes to velocity even when it would have been fine to keep it the same. No one typically plays notes at the same exact velocity each and every time, so it's nice to have some variance while working with this virtual instrument. Of course, there's a chance that the slight changes don't have varied velocities to begin with, because not all sound banks have subtle differences in velocity, but I do it anyway. Here are the patterns. An all-string ensemble supports what our main melody is playing throughout the entirety of the piece. It plays the lower notes of a harmony, which is the pleasant sounding of 2 or more notes. Here are its properties. Now here are the patterns. The transitions are pretty smooth. The piece accomplishes this by holding notes down for as long as possible and making slight changes when needing to move on. This works pretty well when used alongside the next instrument channel. We're going to have a viola ensemble play the higher notes. When working with string sections, try to avoid playing them like piano chords. Instead, give lower pitched strings the lower notes and higher pitched strings the higher notes, for example. Here, I decided to use these two ensembles to match the original sound, but the same idea loosely applies. Anyway, here are the settings we have for it. Now, here are the string patterns, complete. At some point, the strings play the main melody. I created a copy of the viola's channel and raised the volume of the copy. This allows me to avoid interfering with the originals. We'll use the copy for the main melody so that it's easy to hear. We'll also have some volume automation to mimic the playing articulations of the original. Here's the automation. Now here's the pattern. It's a good idea to get used to the way instruments are being played by listening to the changes in their articulations. Having samples of real instruments to work with is great and lets people create all types of music in their bedrooms, but I'm sure there's more to simply laying down the notes of an orchestral instrument. Trying to replicate the performance of real instruments being played is just another step on the staircase to producing realistic sounds. Sorry, I had a rough weekend, okay? I'm sorry. The flute's usage is very simple. Here are its settings. It simply ends the piece with a final melody before the music loops. It also makes use of a mordent, which is a quick advancement of a note to the next pitch, then back to the starting note. The piece is essentially finished, but let's stuff it with more stuff. We're going to force feed it stuff until it sounds better. The piece itself is very simple and calm, so I wanted to avoid using percussion. The guitar does fine for the string section, and I wanted to ensure the ranch theme was intact, so I avoided adding much at all. Instead, I added another woodwind, the ocarina. Digest its settings, taste them! It's active for two parts of the music and has a relatively low profile. I avoided using scale since the guitar does that. Its inclusion is very simple. It only serves to support the starting notes of the main melodies with single notes, which are gradually joined by others. As for the second melody, I avoid playing too many staccato notes for a single measure. I kind of give them space to breathe. As for that last pattern, I created a copy and extended the last notes for the end of the loop. This time, the piece actually ends fine on its own. Just don't make it loop again and you're all set. Everything except the ocarina has a moderate to loud volume. Keep in mind that we used volume automation for the instruments we talked about earlier. Strings were panned to the right while the guitar was panned to the left. The flute and French horn stay centered. We decided to give the ocarina slight panning automation, so it goes from left to right before coming back to the center. Just like that, we completed our third cover. This was definitely the shortest episode so far, and the least difficult. As usual, if you'd like to suggest a piece we should cover next, let me know and I'll consider it. Besides that, stay a while longer to listen to our cover. I'll leave a link of the cover on loop in the description. Thank you for watching. Jerry and I will catch you another time.